Welcome everyone to this extended lecture on the significance of John Dewey's writings in the field of education, and education philosophy in particular. The general form I propose in this lecture has two parts. First off, because these lectures are designed to help you as student teachers enter the field of teaching in a profitable and successful fashion, I want to outline for you some of the good, helpful, and insightful things John Dewey has to teach us in his writings on education. And there are plenty of such things, ladies and gentlemen. Moreover, it's very useful that you should know these good things too. Not only because they will profitably inform your own teaching practice, but also because knowing your Dewey will help you understand the educational system into which you're entering as a professional. Once you've studied Dewey, you'll easily see how his ideas have come to shape education reforms and progressive educational ideas to this day. Sometimes you'll see Dewey's thoughts are right at the heart of many contemporary educational initiatives and policy moves. Other times, however, you'll be able to spot how Dewey's educational thoughts, if anyone with the power were to pay careful attention to them, would lead such administrators to think twice about adopting the latest new fads in education. I'll touch upon instances like this for you. I guess in short, I think it is valuable for you to know Dewey fairly well and to be aware of what is good in his writings because he is so respected in the field of education. Moreover, if you ever want to be accepted in conversations dominated by the language of progressive educators, Plato and the ancients will be of zero assistance to you. Rather, you'll need to learn to speak and to think like Dewey, and to couch your explanations of what you're doing in Deweyan lingo. But don't worry, I'll try my best in these lectures to simplify that language for you, because I know how frustrating it can be to try and figure out what the hell he's talking about lots of times. Let me stress this to you right now. Dewey is pretty much the foundational thinker in educational circles today. I'd almost say that, really, people in education nowadays don't know much at all about educational thought prior to John Dewey, and that very many so-called modern-day education theorists have adopted some of Dewey's insights about education, and they've also sadly taken up many of his misunderstandings about ancient and pre-modern education as their own, using his gloss of all things ancient like a Cole's Notes or Wikipedia's version of the truth about everything previously written. Personally, I find these abuses and unfair dismissals of all things ancient and pre-modern abominable and frustrating, but there you go. Let me be clear as we read Dewey together. I don't want you to believe what Dewey writes about the ancients. In fact, in this course, you have my permission to ignore whatever he says about Plato or the Greeks, or about pre-modern education philosophy generally. Put another way, if you suppose what he is saying about the ancients is actually accurate, you will be sadly misled. But although I think that what he supposes about them is highly inaccurate and unfair, you can still use what he says about them to understand Dewey himself. So, think of the ancient authors he discusses, therefore, less as those authors in actuality, and more like false caricatures of themselves in his hands, like foils, or pawns, or cannon fodder to serve as straw men that he sets up in his arguments in order to knock them down. The important thing here isn't that you master everything that Dewey has to say, but rather that you wander away from reading Dewey, having gathered from his writings some understanding of what is good in him, and what might, in turn, serve as ammunition for when folks challenge you about your own well-conceived, Dewey-grounded pedagogy. Let me ask you a practical question, then, that might guide you as you read Dewey. Can you ground what you are doing in your classroom in Dewey's thought, or in Dewey's educational ideas? If you can, that bodes very well for your pedagogy, and it will also keep the busybodies and wolves away. Also, and here I speak again from experience, ladies and gentlemen, not only is knowing your Dewey good as a means of protecting your own thoughtfully developed teaching practices from attacks by meddlesome people, it's also good to know your Dewey because someday you may find yourself at odds with the latest trends in education, or with new school-wide initiatives for cleaning up everyone's teaching so that it accords with 21st century learning, or whatever. You may, as a teacher, have cultivated certain principles in your practices that you hold dear, and that you know to be true. These principles may have become for you hills upon which you're willing to die when, on occasion, your deeply held views about good teaching put you at odds with some of these new policies. In such unfortunate circumstances, it's very good to know your Dewey. People listen to Dewey on both sides of the teaching spectrum. Now, mind you, there certainly are some serious problems in Dewey's writings. He's not by any means infallible in his thoughts on education. But he's so well regarded that you can use his writings rather effectively, even against the most meddlesome administrators, as a means of posing legitimate questions about some of the more hackneyed and zealous policy changes that higher-ups pour down the cess pipe to land on everyone else's heads. Whereas the first part of this lecture will outline the valuable insights and thoughtful parts of Dewey's work that you will find most helpful in your teaching career, the second half of my talk will be devoted to picking Dewey apart more critically. I want to show you, in that second part, some of the dangers in Dewey's views, and how, in particular, his rejection of the deepest aspects of the ancient traditions and what they have to teach us about learning is detrimental to our understanding not only of education, but of ourselves as well. So let's begin. John Dewey lived from 1859 to 1952. He's widely recognized as the foremost American philosopher of the 20th century. And this is a point we'll return to in the second half of our lecture. Looking at the school system that dominated during his day, Dewey wrote, "No one has ever explained why children are so full of questions outside of the school and the conspicuous absence of display of curiosity about the subject matter of school lessons." Unquote. In this regard, I'd say things haven't changed very much in schools. How can life be so interesting, but school so terribly uninteresting? Believe it or not, it was kind of revolutionary at the time for Dewey to say that what is missing in schools is any concern for student interest. That is to say, students only really learn when they're motivated intrinsically to do so, when they're studying what matters personally to them. So the first thing I want you to remember about Dewey is how he accentuates the importance of cultivating and grounding everything you can as a teacher in student interest. Just a bit of a tangent here. Sometimes I think that folks suppose Dewey discovered interest and the importance of authentic learning in schools. But really he didn't. 2,500 years ago, Plato wrote in his Republic that no forced study abides in a soul. In other words, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, and that people only really learn if they love what they're learning. Plato didn't call that interest, mind you. He used the much older word eros, meaning desire. Regardless, real, genuine, lasting learning only happens when it's driven by the heart of the one doing the learning. And really, I think it's safe to say that all the big shooter philosophers of education for thousands of years have pretty much acknowledged that fact. But for some reason, what's acknowledged in theory isn't always what gets accentuated in practice. With mass education in modern times, the importance of student interest certainly took a back seat. The model for education at the time of Dewey was the assembly line, right? So, important ideas and insights can get lost in the massive upheavals and societal changes that sweep over societies from time to time. And obviously, whether or not a little cog in a little wheel in a big factory, say the individual student, well, doesn't have very much significance in the grand scheme of things, right? So, student interest seemed a rather ridiculous thing to be concerned about, where the point was instead to produce identical widget-type students all prepared for the widget-type work of the industrialized economy. Student interest went by the wayside in such a system. So we can thank Dewey for reminding everyone of the primary importance of student interest in learning and schooling today. Indeed, I'd say if there's one thing to remember having read Dewey, it's this. Remember how what he has to say supports the importance of finding things for kids to do that they want to do. Try your best to set things up so that students can develop their own goals and pursue these purposes cooperatively with one another. Let them, wherever possible, follow their own interests. Design experiences for them in good, rich learning environments that are authentic, that are meaningful to them, and relevant to them in their own lives in understanding themselves. Avoid wherever possible just creating canned exercises, busy work, or items on a list of things to do that don't capture their interests. This is generally what folks today are talking about when they speak about the importance of student engagement in learning. In modern times, all this goes back to Dewey. Now, besides the value of interest in education, another important aspect of Dewey's writings on education is the stress he places upon education as the key to living in a socially progressive democracy. In his view, a democratic education must not be viewed simply instrumentally as a means towards a vocation or as a means simply to pass down traditions, customs, or information from the older generation to a younger one. Education certainly does those things too, but those functions are not its true core value in a democracy. Rather, Dewey contends that all genuine education must be understood not as a means to an end, but primarily as an end in itself. For starters, Dewey is big on pointing out that education isn't the same thing as training. In his view, education by its nature is a conjoint or cooperative activity in which human beings share common goals and common interests. Democratic education is about not just this man's success or that social group's welfare, but establishing and working toward the common good of everyone collectively, after all. This idea of commonality and cooperation is big for Dewey, because he's so firmly committed to the ideals of American democracy. And one of the major things about democracy is that it's not authoritarian, right? Democracy is rather ruled by the people, for the people. The democratic form of government is meant to support and culture a society of free individuals. But free individuals are only ruled by consent, right? So the ideas of freedom and consent are primary in a democracy. And yet, it's hard to get folks to agree freely and consensually to a common understanding of what is good, particularly where you have a richly pluralistic and multicultural society like Canada or the United States. Democracy, Dewey thinks, doesn't function so well where you cannot find common ground with your neighbor, where, for instance, the haves have it all, and the have-nots have next to nothing at all, where enormous social imbalances and economic injustices prevail, where populations are segregated and balkanized against one another, only identifying with their own, and not able to dialogue or to cooperate with others outside of their own smaller, disparate social groupings. So in a democracy, A certain kind of education is needed that teaches folks not to be at odds with one another, or to always be in a deathmatch competition with one another. No. What is needed for a truly progressive democracy is an education that fosters conjoint activity and cooperation among its diverse population. One that helps to tear down walls between people, and that creates a broader, common community among them, in which a sense of the common good might arise through mutuality and consensus. Dewey's concern with democratic education relates very well also to what he says about the importance of interest and of allowing students to develop and pursue their own aims, purposes, and goals in school. That is, in a democracy where what is sought is voluntary participation in a common good, folks need to learn how to develop their own free-thinking approach to things. The ends, purposes, or goals we pursue in a proper democracy aren't foisted upon us authoritatively. We pick them for ourselves. So, a democracy, or rather a democratic education, ought to give you practice in creating your own goals, in designing means towards those goals, and in testing not only the effectiveness of those means, but also of the goals themselves that we've chosen. Moreover, in a pluralistic democratic society, there will be a ton of different goals, each to his own. Chacun son goût, eh? Hence, democratic education will involve an exceptionally rich sharing and mixing of interests, in which goals will be shared, debated, and discussed. This more diverse mixture of goals and goal setting and means testing will, in Dewey's view, produce a collaborative environment for more rich learning, and one in which democracy might especially thrive. Which is why, incidentally, education in a democracy can't just be behavioristic training for a job, or why it cannot simply be conditioning or stimulating a response in people so that in situation X they perform function Y. No. Educational activity must be conjoint. Training is okay for animals, but not really for humans. Education as training is not premised upon the conjoint sharing of interests. For instance, say Farmer Bob takes his horse Bullseye out to the back 40 to plow the field. Both Farmer Bob and his horse are out there working together at the tilling, but their activity is not conjoint. The horse doesn't share Farmer Bob's goal of plowing in order to ready the fields for planting and eventually for harvest. Nope. Old Bullseye probably just wants his oat bag. Education arises only where there is a cooperative atmosphere and a conjoint activity in which interests are shared. A good democratic education, therefore, is one in which folks talk about what is of interest to themselves and to each other. It's one in which they discuss together what is most important, what they share in common with one another, and how they might collectively and cooperatively work to achieve conjointly agreed to aims, goals, purposes. Put another way, there can be no genuine democracy where only one part of the society, like Farmer Bob, makes all the decisions and simply uses the other part of the society, like Bullseye, as its workforce to achieve goals that have no relation to them, and in which they have no input or express no interest. Now, I think this particular idea of education as a good in itself seems still to escape the notice of policymakers even today, who look to education rather more as a means to an end. That end being the production of workers and of entrepreneurs to create jobs and to fill those jobs that will in turn make the economy move successfully. Indeed, you can see this tendency towards a purely instrumental view of education most prominently in the way that universities have been transformed over the past several decades. Many books have been written about this particular subject, ladies and gentlemen, so I won't belabor the point. But a very good little one was written recently by Ian Angus entitled Love the Questions, University Education and Enlightenment. Although Dewey isn't mentioned by the author in this book, Ian Angus certainly makes a good Deweyan critique of how, in the past several decades, our governments have turned away from conceiving any responsibility in post-secondary schooling towards education as more than a job qualification process, and therefore as being more than a private matter. Education seems to have become, in their eyes, more like a contract between potential worker students who pay tuition and corporate educators who grant accreditation for future job prospects. Indeed, if there's any notion of education as a conjoint activity inquiring into the nature of the common good, or of members of Canadian society having anything in common, or a common good at all, it's only in regards to the need to buoy up the economy, to protect our resources, or Canadian birthrights, or Albertan birthrights, and to outperform our foreign competitors in new modes of consumption and production. Any inkling of education as something more than that, say, as being deeply to do with the matter of citizenship, and that citizenship means more than being an effective producer and or a responsible consumer, well, this idea of education for democracy seems to have been largely dropped now that universities are run like businesses, and now that they must rely for the lion's share of their funding on corporate sponsors. Dewey would not like this turn in our current way of doing things, I think. Yet another important aspect of Dewey's understanding that is important for us to remember is how he says that education is the process of forming fundamental dispositions. Dewey's emphasis on dispositions, that is to say, on habits, on character, or perhaps what might in olden times be termed virtue. This is so important, ladies and gentlemen. And I think it's also being sadly overlooked by today's education reformers. Think of how today, for instance, when you want to know if a student's doing well in school and whether or not he or she is learning anything, you look at their marks. If the boy has an A, he must really be excelling in his education, eh? Similarly, if he has a D-, then there is some reason to be concerned about his educational performance. But what do such letters have to do with dispositions? Say you want to find out if Sally has learned her mathematics and her physics. You give her a test. Or maybe you offer her the chance to do a project in which she can demonstrate her emerging knowledge, her skills, and so forth. Well, suppose then that Sally writes the test, or that she completes the project, and she does so very proficiently. She earns an A. Well done, Sally! And maybe not just Sally is doing well, maybe there's a move on in your home state or province towards accountability in education, where no child is left behind. Maybe everyone now, both teachers and students, is beholden to improving their performance statistics in relation to government-mandated objectives and benchmarks. Maybe everyone is backward planning like hell. Maybe Sally's school is doing better and better every year in the Fraser Institute number-crunching reports on education. Let's have a group hug. Let's all pat ourselves on the back over that one. But then, say, 2 weeks later, 3 months later, maybe a year later, what does Sally actually remember? What sticks with her? How much of what Sally has learned through all of this collective sweating and toiling, how much of it has actually made a lasting impression on her? Perhaps she's forgotten everything. That's very likely. After all, let's be honest, folks, how much of what you learned in school did you simply master for the time being, for the test, or for the purposes of the project, and in order to achieve result X in the immediate situation, only to forget it as soon as it was no longer needed or necessary to you. So sure, Sally learned her physics all right for the assessments, but she retained none of it, so nothing sticks. Just as Plato said 2,500 years earlier, no forced study will abide in Sally's soul. No fundamental dispositions have been formed there. And yet, Sally is such a fine student on paper, eh? Geez, just look at her marks. But where at all is the genuine education? The one concerned with the formation of dispositions. I really appreciate Dewey on this count, ladies and gentlemen. I like it because it's humbling and because it makes proud people uneasy who think that the quality of education in their school can be measured by the number of kids who are passing, by the number of kids who are excelling on paper, and by the number of CEUs, or credit enrollment units, earned collectively by the student body that year. I think it's very good to ask yourself, as you enter your teaching careers, how you will endeavor to foster dispositions among the students who move through your classroom over the years. Nowadays, and I think I can say this confidently from my own experiences in such matters, there is a good deal of ideological nonsense and zealotry in schools. One of the most recent trends that you'll find everywhere in schools now is the no-zero policy. Be warned, ladies and gentlemen, do not voice your opposition to this policy in earshot of administrators or of people hot for a name as progressive educators hip to the latest education research and policy initiatives. The no-zero policy has become the new orthodoxy in schools, and to speak against it will label you not only as a heretic, but also as uneducated and quite likely unemployable. However, I mention it here because the no-zero policy in assessment is an excellent example of a new research-based policy that flies in the face of Dewey and 2,500 years of education philosophy besides. A little bit of a tangent, but what is this no-zero policy? Well, it essentially means that you cannot give students zeros for work not handed in. The only thing a mark can measure is student performance in relation to the mandated outcomes in the program of studies. Anything else that you're doing in your class that doesn't have to do with those outcomes, you can't give a mark for that. So, marks can only measure performance of students in the products and processes of demonstrating their knowledge and skills. Get it? So far, so good. Well, when students don't hand in their work, you're marking them on work that they haven't handed in, right? You're assigning a grade to something that doesn't exist when you give a zero for it. No-zero orthodoxy says you can't do that. Only what a kid hands in can be marked, not what a kid has not handed in. You can't even use a zero as a placeholder in your mark book. And by a placeholder, I mean putting down a zero in the records for that assignment until the student hands it in. You know, after you've hounded and chased him around the school and called home and all the other endless things we try to do to get them to complete their work. If they end up actually finishing the assignment, then you take the zero out and you replace it with the mark they earned. That's not allowed anymore. Similarly, you can't give out late penalties anymore. The idea behind this prohibition is that students must mark, or rather a student's mark must only reflect the quality of his or her submission, and that the quality has nothing to do with when it was handed in. Say you assign a paper in your class during September, and all the students work hard to get it in by the 2-week deadline, except Bobby. Then, at the very end of semester, maybe the day before marks are due, Bobby finally hands it in. Oh yeah, and he hands in about 50 other missing assignments at the same time. all crumpled up in a ball from the back of his locker. You have to mark all those assignments, taking them in without penalty, right? Unlike in a basketball game, where if you throw a basket after the buzzer has rung, it doesn't count in terms of player's performance, right? In school, there can be no such buzzer. A basket is a basket. So you give, or here's another one. Say you give the bank your mortgage payments 6 weeks after they're due. What happens to your house? Not the same with the school either. A paper handed in 3 months late is still the same as that paper were it handed in on time. In a no-zero world, a mark cannot ever reflect anything except the quality of the student's productions or processes in relation to the mandated outcomes. And just so you know, you'll not find handing it in on time anywhere in the mandated outcomes, ladies and gentlemen. And as with not handed ins or NHIs, you can't apply late penalties to major papers, even as placeholders in your marking books. Say, as an incentive for students to take advantage at a later date and in another assignment or given another opportunity to try to make good on their past missteps with some makeup work, for instance. This amount of professional discretion is no longer afforded to you as teachers. Absolute conformity of practice is now demanded in the implementation of no-zero policies, regardless of how reasonable your own assessment plans and alternative practices might be. I was recently in a meeting of education professors at a nameless institution where many of the instructors happened to be ex-school administrators, and most especially the kinds of folks who like to tell teachers what they're doing wrong. When the subject of late penalties was broached in our meeting, several of them were all aghast that this apparently barbaric practice still goes on. One woman in particular was downright offended, saying with much threat, "If any teacher of any of my children were to slap a late penalty on one of their papers, well, I'd really let that teacher have it." Jeez. And that's not all there is to the no-zero orthodoxy, folks. You can't even give a 0 for plagiarized papers or for cheating on tests anymore. Why? Because the marks students receive can only represent that student's own performance. But a paper that was stolen or a test that was cheated on aren't that student's own work. So you can't mark it, eh? You can't give it a 0. Marks only measure student achievement, and the stolen material was not that student's achievement. End of story. See how the logic of that orthodoxy works? There are some really big shooters in no-zero policy, like Thomas Guskey and Douglas Reeves. And administrators eat this stuff up too. Not only because it's hip and trendy, but also because in their view, the statistics don't lie. See, when it becomes impossible to give out 0s for plagiarism, for cheating, for work not handed in, or late penalties for the same reason, well, marks naturally go up. And failure rates go down. And when you're at the top of the food chain as the administrator, and when you see these results in your school, naturally you start to feel good about yourself. Look at how successful everyone is being on your watch. And then you get all those extra CEUs, and the money starts to roll in. Man, you're an educational genius all of a sudden. So be warned, folks. Don't get in the way of people who have swallowed the orthodoxy down, because they'll bulldoze you hard, like they did up in Edmonton a few years ago to that teacher, Lyndon Dorval. You need to watch yourself. Now, I mention this in this orthodoxy in relation to the thought of John Dewey, ladies and gentlemen, because Dewey's nice, simple statement about the importance of dispositions in education just explodes all this zealous nonsense, and it deeply challenges what the meaning of a grade is, by the way. Take Sally again. Her A's in math and science show that Sally has demonstrated excellence in relation to the stated outcomes of the math and science programs of studies, right? But then, a week after her tests, Sally remembers nothing. She's learned how to work the system. She knows what she has to do to earn the grades she needs. Who knows? Maybe Sally had her identical twin, Jane, come into the exam room and write all those exams for her. Maybe her mom did her project work at home for her. Maybe Sally cheated. But Sally wasn't caught cheating, and that's preposterous that she would do such a thing. And her marks reflect the level of excellence exhibited in whatever she handed in, after all. But what about Sally's dispositions? Nothing in Sally's grades reflects any long-standing dispositions. Her test marks say nothing about her dispositions. Sally actually doesn't care about anything of what she's learned. She's just pushing through all of it and forgets it soon afterwards. Similarly, what about Nick? Nick cheated, and he plagiarized. He was a serial cheater, in fact. And whatever he did hand in that was actually his own work, he submitted late. As a student in academic English, Nick committed to a certain level of expectations with regard to honesty. And he promised to hand his work in on time. That's part of being an academic student, right? Anyway, these are all parts of being academically responsible as a student. And yet, we cannot include them in our appraisals of Nick's education in terms of his grades. But aren't these matters, not the stuff about getting the right answer on the test that Sally's so good at, aren't these matters the things that pertain deeply to education and the formation of dispositions? Isn't demonstrating good daily effort, something we can't mark anymore, by the way, and always trying your best to get your work done an indication of a fine disposition? Isn't keeping your promises and fulfilling your obligations towards others and towards classroom expectations about honesty and timeliness an indication that you're developing those dispositions that will likewise be integral for you becoming a good citizen and a fine neighbor? Doesn't the propensity towards theft and dishonesty versus trustworthiness and truth-telling not say something rather profound about one's dispositions? And yet, these deepest of all observations, these observations that most closely bear witness to education as the formation of dispositions in the Deweyan sense, these self-same things must never be included in the marks earned by our students. No, 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 no! Thus far in our discussion of Dewey, we've talked about the value of his emphases on student interest, on democratic education, and on the formation of dispositions. But out of all the things you'll hear about Dewey, maybe the most popular item attributed to him is inquiry-based learning. In fact, most people nowadays seem to think that Dewey invented the idea of inquiry-based learning. Of course, those of you who have listened at all to my earlier lectures in this series know that such a view is a crock, and that the ancient philosophers were long ago talking about inquiry and how inquiry is foundational to human nature. Aristotle even begins his book, The Metaphysics, with the words, "All human beings desire to know." All human beings are inquirers. So no, Dewey didn't invent the idea of education as inquiry. Mind you, as we will see in the second half of this lecture, Dewey's ideas about what counts as inquiry are a fair bit narrower than those promulgated by the ancients. And I think that this narrowing has some unsettling implications for both education in general as well as for our ability to know ourselves. But, be that as it may, Dewey's advocacy for inquiry in schools is refreshing. Inquiry makes for good education, and it's important for you to consider how Dewey and inquiry might enrich your own classroom practices as well. So, what is inquiry-based learning? For Dewey, inquiry-based learning is essentially the use of the scientific method, which he calls variously the method of intelligence, as well as reflection, pure and simple. In his view, scientific method is the only authentic means at our command for getting at the significance of our everyday experiences of the world in which we live. Science, in Dewey's mind, is, quote, the perfected outcome of learning, as well as the safeguard of the race, unquote. Dewey honestly thinks that the way towards social progress is paved by science. That if only folks were more adept in the scientific method, if only they made the scientific method more integral in all of their doings and applied it everywhere in their lives, then all of us would be so much better off. There would be social progress, and harmony would be everywhere. It would abound through the relief of man's estate and the benefits of science. All right, then. Well, let's start off with Dewey's definition of inquiry. Dewey calls inquiry the mutual adjustment between an organism and its environment. So, you and I are the organisms, ladies and gentlemen. The world around us is our environment. And we, as organisms, have to get along and grow in that environment. See, for Dewey, and we'll come back to this, the final criterion in everything is growth. Dewey rejects any what he calls external goals, aims, or imposed purposes in education, right? You can't rightly set goals for other people. Every goal must come from within. Moreover, every goal is tentative and centered in the temporal situation that is afoot. There are no eternal goals or eternal verities, according to Dewey. All authentic goals must arise from student interest, which is pretty relativistic when you think about it. But rejecting any and all such final ends or purposes, what the ancients called teloi, Dewey nonetheless still has to speak about something that all genuine education aims at. And that something for him is growth. Dewey's language about us and what we're doing in our lives as human beings is often couched in this language of science, and of biological science in particular, ladies and gentlemen. So, using his lingo, we are organisms bent on growth for growth's sake. Our education is what helps us do that. Anyway, as Dewey was saying, you and I are the organisms, and the world around us is the environment. We have to live and to grow, so we do things to the environment in order to get along there. But then, the environment always does things back to us too, eh? So next, we observe those changes, making plans based upon them. And then we either stay the course with what we're doing, because it seems to be working just fine in relation to our goals and our growth, or we make subsequent changes to our actions, and round it goes. See, there's a recursive loop here between the organisms who go around doing things and the environment, which, having things done to it, in turn does things to us. Dewey goes on to say that inquiry is, quote, the controlled or directed transformation of an indeterminate situation into one that is so determinate in its constituent distinctions and relations as to convert the elements of the original situation into a unified whole. Well, that's a bit confusing, isn't it? Let's see if I can clear things up for you in this definition of inquiry. Basically, when you're exercising the method of intelligence, reflection, or the scientific method, you're engaged in a series of steps as a learner or an inquirer. First, in any inquiry, there is a perplexity, or something weird that bothers you, something you can't quite figure out. That's the indeterminate situation, see? Next, because this situation is problematic for you, you start to try to think up explanations for it, reasons for it, maybe solutions for it. So this is where you start to conjecture about how things work, or why they do what they do. Next, you survey or observe all kinds of things that comprise that situation. What happens if I do X? Or what are all the components of Y? After that, you start to form a tentative hypothesis about the situation that will allow you to understand how and why things work the way they do. Then, after you've made your hypothesis, you test it out and see if it works. Once you've got a handle on why things work the way they do, say you've found out that your hypothesis about X is correct, then you've mastered the situation, right? It's no longer indeterminate in your mind, but rather determinate, to use Dewey's lingo. You can see the big picture now in your grand hypothesis, eh? You've rendered it all in a unified whole. Does that make sense? The key to inquiry is that the steps in a, quote, reflective situation must be followed. That is to say, inquirers move from identifying a problem to the collection and analysis of data, to projecting and elaborating ideas and hypothesis building, to experimental application and testing, and finally, to a conclusion based on judgments of the results. In inquiry-based learning, students must be given something to do, not something to learn. That is to say, you as the teacher are to serve as an architect of learning for them. You are to design an environment in which their educational experiences might transpire. They must be provided with genuine situations of experience. By this, Dewey means that the problems the students encounter must be authentically their own problems. They must be relevant to their own lives, not mock or simulated problems from a canned list generated by the teacher or in the textbook. Dewey supposes that such scientifically focused, personalized learning experiences are really the best, or perhaps the only, way of encouraging thinking in one's classroom. For in his view, thinking is always perspective. It's always occasioned by unsettlement and aimed at overcoming a disturbance, unquote. All thinking, in Dewey's view, involves acting to make a change. All thinking is concerned with causality, with discovering causal relations and causal chains between things. Moreover, all social progress hinges upon our ability to do this, to increase our scientific knowledge and mastery over the world. Dewey is in this regard a follower of men like Descartes, who view the world of nature as res extensa, as matter ripe for mastery by res cogitan, or mind. In fact, Dewey is most definitely an admirer of Francis Bacon, who is often called the father of empiricism in the scientific method. He's most definitely a major figure in the scientific revolution. Anyway, borrowing an image from the political theorist Niccolo Machiavelli, Francis Bacon, who was himself a contemporary of René Descartes, wrote famously, "We shall put nature to the rack and compel her to answer our questions." In Bacon's eyes, then, the relation of the scientist to the world, in other words, is one of torturer to tortured. It's one of master to the mastered, of conqueror to the subjugated. In his own paraphrase of Bacon's words, John Dewey writes in wholehearted agreement, quote, The true scientist must force the apparent facts of nature into forms different to those in which they familiarly present themselves, and thus make them tell their truth about themselves, as torture may compel an unwilling witness to reveal what he has been concealing. Unquote. The act of experimentation of the modern scientist, therefore, must replace the passive contemplation of the ancient and medieval philosophers. Knowing no longer is admitted to transpire through loving, but rather through an objectivization of the world that results in ever-increasing power. In Dewey's own words, nature is the medium of social occurrences. It furnishes original stimuli. It supplies obstacles and resources. Civilization is the progressive mastery of its varied energies. Unquote. The subjugation of nature by means of scientific mastery over the world, in other words, is Dewey's vision for the civilizational progress of mankind.